The ocean was supposed to be their greatest shield. Miles of black water, crushing pressure, and endless darkness were meant to hide them forever. Soviet submarine commanders believed that once they slipped beneath the waves, they vanished from the world above. In the silent depths of the Cold War, their steel giants carried nuclear missiles capable of destroying entire cities. They believed they were invisible, untouchable, unstoppable. But somewhere deep in the Atlantic, a terrifying realization slowly began to spread through the Soviet Navy. The United States could hear everything. The Cold War was not just fought with tanks, spies, and nuclear missiles. It was fought in silence. Beneath the oceans, hundreds of submarines from both superpowers stalked one another in a deadly underwater chess match. These submarines carried weapons powerful enough to end civilization, and the side that could remain hidden had the ultimate advantage. For years, Soviet naval planners believed their submarines could move undetected through the world's oceans, waiting silently for the order that would never come unless the world ended in nuclear fire. What they did not know was that the United States had already turned the ocean itself into a massive listening device. In the late 1950s, American scientists and naval strategists began working on one of the most secretive projects in military history. It was called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. At first glance, it sounded simple, a network of underwater microphones placed across strategic locations in the ocean. But the science behind it was revolutionary. The U.S. Navy had discovered something extraordinary about how sound travels underwater. Deep in the ocean lies a layer known as the SOFAR channel, a natural acoustic pathway where sound waves can travel thousands of miles with almost no loss of energy. A submarine propeller turning in the North Atlantic could potentially be heard hundreds, even thousands of miles away if the sensors were placed correctly. American engineers began laying massive arrays of hydrophones across the Atlantic Ocean. These sensors were placed on the seabed near choke points where Soviet submarines would have to pass if they wanted to reach the open ocean. Places like the GI-UK Gap, the narrow corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, became critical listening posts. Any Soviet submarine leaving its bases in the Arctic or the Baltic Sea would almost certainly pass through these waters, and when they did, the ocean itself would betray them. Inside secure listening stations along the U.S. East Coast and across NATO territory, analysts spent their days staring at strange patterns scrolling across monitors. They called these patterns LOFARgrams, visual representations of underwater sound frequencies. Each submarine had a unique acoustic fingerprint. The number of propeller blades, the slight imperfections in the engine, even tiny vibrations in the hull created a sound signature that could be recognized once recorded. Over time, American analysts built a massive library of Soviet submarine signatures. It became possible not only to detect a submarine, but to identify exactly which class it belonged to, and sometimes even which specific vessel it was. The Soviet Union had no idea. Confident in their stealth, Soviet submarine crews pushed deeper into the Atlantic. Their mission was clear. If nuclear war ever erupted, they would position themselves close enough to American shores to launch devastating missile strikes. These submarines were meant to be ghosts in the water, invisible weapons waiting in silence. Yet every movement they made was quietly being tracked. The United States Navy could often detect Soviet submarines the moment they left their home ports. From that point on, American forces could shadow them across entire oceans without ever revealing their presence. American attack submarines, especially the quiet and advanced nuclear-powered boats of the U.S. fleet, began to take full advantage of this information. Guided by SOSUS data, they could intercept Soviet submarines and follow them closely, sometimes for days or even weeks. The Soviet crews believed they were alone in the depths. In reality, an American submarine might be silently trailing just a few kilometers behind them, recording every sound their vessel made. For the United States, this technological advantage was more than just a tactical edge. It was a strategic shield. Knowing the location of Soviet ballistic missile submarines meant the U.S. Navy could potentially neutralize them if war broke out. Even more importantly, it provided early warning of Soviet naval activity. The ocean was no longer a hiding place, it had become a vast surveillance network. But the greatest shock for the Soviet Union came when they finally began to suspect the truth. In the 1960s and 1970s, Soviet naval engineers noticed something deeply troubling. American submarines seemed to appear at the exact places where Soviet vessels were operating. Interceptions were happening too frequently to be coincidence. Others feared the Americans had developed new sonar technologies capable of detecting even the quietest submarines. The truth was far more unsettling. The ocean itself was listening. As the decades passed, Soviet engineers worked desperately to make their submarines quieter. Early Soviet submarines were notoriously loud compared to their American counterparts. Machinery vibrations, poorly isolated engines, and noisy propellers made them relatively easy to detect with acoustic sensors. Realizing the danger, Soviet designers began redesigning their vessels. They introduced better sound insulation, improved propeller designs, and quieter reactor systems. Each new class of submarine was an attempt to escape the invisible ears of the American listening network. Yet the United States continued to stay one step ahead. American submarines such as the Los Angeles-class attack boats were among the quietest machines ever built. Advanced sonar systems allowed them to detect enemy vessels from incredible distances, while their own acoustic signature remained extremely difficult to detect. Combined with SOSUS intelligence, this gave the United States Navy an extraordinary ability to monitor Soviet underwater activity across much of the globe. One of the most dramatic examples of this underwater shadow war occurred during routine Cold War patrols when American submarines would deliberately follow Soviet ballistic missile submarines. These submarines carried nuclear missiles capable of destroying dozens of American cities, yet many of them spent entire patrols unknowingly followed by American submarines that were listening, recording, and waiting. If nuclear war had ever erupted, those American submarines would have been in position to strike immediately. For Soviet commanders, this possibility was terrifying. Their entire strategy depended on the idea that their missile submarines could survive long enough to retaliate after a nuclear strike. If the United States could track them in advance, that strategy collapsed. The balance of nuclear deterrence itself could be threatened. By the late Cold War, the Soviet Union had begun investing enormous resources into quieter submarines, including the famous Akula-class attack submarines. These vessels represented a massive leap forward in Soviet submarine technology and were far more difficult to detect than earlier models. Even so, the decades-long acoustic advantage held by the United States had already reshaped the underwater battlefield. The story of SOSUS, the silent listening war beneath the oceans, remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. Most Americans had no idea that an enormous underwater surveillance network was protecting their shores. Hidden beneath the waves, thousands of sensors were quietly recording the sounds of the deep, turning the entire Atlantic Ocean into a massive intelligence system. What made this achievement even more remarkable was that it relied not only on advanced technology, but also on human skill. The analysts who studied sonar data developed an almost musical ability to recognize patterns in underwater noise. To an untrained ear, the recordings sounded like random mechanical hums and distant vibrations, but to experienced operators, each sound told a story. They could distinguish between merchant ships, fishing vessels, whales, and submarines. Some could even identify individual submarines based on subtle acoustic details. It was a form of warfare fought almost entirely in silence. The Soviet Union eventually realized that the Americans possessed an extensive underwater detection network, but the full extent of the system remained unclear for decades. Only after the Cold War ended did many of these secrets become public. Historians and naval experts began to understand just how significant the SOSUS system had been in maintaining the strategic balance during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. Without firing a single shot, the United States had managed to monitor one of the most powerful naval forces on Earth. By listening to the ocean itself, American scientists and sailors had created a defensive advantage that helped prevent catastrophic miscalculations during the Cold War. The silent battle beneath the waves was one of the most remarkable technological achievements of the 20th century. While missiles, bombers, and armies dominated headlines, the true guardians of strategic stability often sat quietly in dimly lit listening stations, watching sonar patterns scroll across glowing screens. Far below the surface, the ocean carried every sound, and for decades, the United States was listening.